Japanese soldiers couldn't believe American convoys stretched beyond the horizon. Defense. December 6, 1944. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, east of Leyte, the horizon was a blur of mist and steel, where the waves themselves seemed to carry an army. Japanese lookouts, squinting from their battered destroyers, rubbed their eyes as if struck by a hallucination. Ship after ship, transport after transport, emerged out of the fog like a tide that refused to end. What began as a few silhouettes grew into a colossal armada. Cargo vessels, oilers, troop transports, supply ships, and sleek warships, escorting them in disciplined rows. They stretched farther than the human eye could follow, farther than the curvature of the earth would allow. For the Japanese sailors staring out from their posts, it was not simply a convoy. It was a moving continent, an iron highway across the sea. The sea breeze carried the faint smell of oil and the low growl of engines, a constant, vibrating hum that settled into the bones. It was the sound of America's war machine on the march, vast beyond comprehension. The Japanese had fought for years against American submarines, cruisers, and carriers, but this was something else entirely. Not an isolated fleet, not a single battle group, but a living artery of war, pulsing across the Pacific. Every mile of that convoy represented another nail in Japan's coffin. On the decks of their destroyers, Japanese officers raised binoculars, hoping the glass would end the illusion. Yet the longer they looked, the worse the nightmare became. A line of grey hulls dissolved into the haze, only to re-emerge farther out, ship after ship after ship. They counted 100, then 200. Then they stopped counting. There was no end. The horizon was swallowed whole by America's industrial might. Fear ran cold through the veins of seasoned sailors who had braved Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. They had seen fleets destroyed in a single day, men drowning in seas of fire, aircraft plummeting in spirals of smoke. Yet nothing had prepared them for this sight. This was not destruction, it was creation. An endless birth of ships from American shipyards, flowing west like a river that could never be dammed. The convoy moved with a rhythm, an eerie precision. Merchant ships groaned forward, their decks stacked with crates, fuel drums, and trucks, lashed down with chains. Troop transports carried tens of thousands of soldiers, fresh, rested, armed to the teeth. Men who had never seen defeat, men eager to bring the war home to Japan's shores. Alongside them, oilers carried the lifeblood of mechanized war, ensuring the engines of Sherman tanks and Hellcat fighters would never go thirsty. Every category of vessel had its role, every role tied into a larger design. The escorts bristled with menace. Fletcher-class destroyers sliced through the waves with guns ready, their radar masts spinning like sentinels. Light cruisers scanned the sky, their anti-aircraft batteries loaded, waiting for the telltale whine of incoming kamikaze. Overhead, carrier-based patrol planes circled like hawks, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. To the Japanese it was a terrifying orchestration, a machine of war so complete that no weak point could be found. One petty officer, his face lined from years of salt air and sleepless nights, whispered a phrase that spread like wildfire among the crew. "The Americans have ships like we have stars." It was not exaggeration. The Empire of Japan had once prided itself on its navy, the Kido Butai that had brought the Pacific to its knees at Pearl Harbor. But now, looking upon this endless tide, the officers realized the truth. Japan had awakened a giant, and that giant was no longer angry. It was unstoppable. The convoy carried not just supplies but inevitability. Behind every crate of ammunition lay the factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, roaring day and night. Behind every transport packed with soldiers lay the training camps of Texas, California, and New Jersey, where an endless stream of recruits marched forward. Behind every oiler lay the oil fields of Texas and the refineries of Louisiana, pouring black gold into tankers faster than Japan could sink them. The convoy was more than steel and men. It was the embodiment of America's home front, projected thousands of miles across the Pacific. From the Japanese perspective, it was a vision of despair. Their submarines, once the silent predators of the sea, had been hunted nearly to extinction. Their pilots, once fearless and bold, now faced radar-guided gunners who filled the sky with steel. And now their sailors, standing helpless on the decks of undersupplied ships, watched a tide that could not be stopped. They could fire torpedoes, they could launch kamikazes, They could fight to the death, but the convoys would keep coming. Like waves against a shore they would never see. In the silence of the observation deck, an officer finally lowered his binoculars. His voice was hoarse, almost broken, as he muttered to his men, "We cannot fight this. We cannot even dream of it." His words were not recorded in any official log, but they carried the weight of a nation's fading hope. What they witnessed was not merely an enemy convoy, it was a preview of the end. The convoy steamed westward, leaving white wakes that stretched like scars across the ocean's surface. The Japanese destroyers turned away, unable to challenge what they had seen. In the stillness that followed, the men of the Imperial Navy carried the image with them, a nightmare vision of America's inexhaustible strength. The Pacific, once Japan's empire of conquest, had become a highway for American victory, and in that moment, as convoys stretched endlessly beyond the horizon, the outcome of the war was written not in fire or blood, but in steel and supply. ChatGPT said, by late 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a struggle of momentum and resources. Japan, once the predator of the seas, found itself shrinking under the weight of attrition. The tide had begun to turn as early as Midway in 1942, but by the autumn of 1944, the reversal was complete. The empire that had stretched across Asia and the Pacific now clung desperately to its perimeter, retreating from island to island under the crushing weight of American power. At the heart of this reversal was not just courage on the battlefield, nor brilliance in the skies, but something far more fundamental: logistics. Where Japan saw war as a clash of warriors, America understood it as a clash of production lines, supply routes, and industrial might. Every shell fired, every plane launched, every soldier landed required a chain of ships to carry the weight of a continent's industry across thousands of miles of open water. Without that lifeline, the Pacific campaign would have starved before it even reached Japan's doorstep. For the Japanese, this concept was alien. Their early war strategy had been built upon decisive strikes, lightning campaigns, and the hope that a stunned America would sue for peace. At Pearl Harbor, at the Philippines, at Singapore, they had gambled everything on shock and speed. Their doctrine envisioned quick victories before America's vast industry could mobilize. But by 1944 the bet had failed. Instead of suing for peace, America had awakened, and now the United States was moving west with a tempo no nation had ever achieved in modern war. The Pacific theater was unique in its demands. Unlike Europe, where railroads and roads could funnel supplies directly to the front, every operation in the Pacific required the movement of men and machines across vast oceans. From the factories of Chicago to the beaches of the Philippines, the journey stretched over 10,000 miles. Every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of gasoline had to be floated across that distance. And so the war became a test of convoys, an experiment in how much weight could be moved, how quickly, and how safely. The Japanese had once believed their submarine force could sever these arteries. In 1942 they sent their I-class boats prowling the Pacific, striking at oil tankers and cargo ships. Yet unlike the Germans in the Atlantic, the Japanese never committed fully to commerce raiding. Their submarines hunted warships instead of supply ships, a choice rooted in samurai tradition, to slay the warrior, not the servant. It was a fatal miscalculation. By 1944, American convoys had grown too vast to disrupt, their escorts too well armed, their routes too well defended. The Americans, on the other hand, built their entire strategy around convoys. They understood that without constant supply, the leapfrogging campaign through the Pacific Islands would collapse. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Leyte, every invasion demanded mountains of supplies, ammunition, tanks, artillery, fuel, construction equipment, food, even prefabricated airstrips. A single division consumed thousands of tons of material in weeks. Multiply that by dozens of divisions and fleets of carriers, and the numbers soared into figures almost beyond imagination. It was here that the United States revealed its true advantage. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched nearly 6,000 Liberty ships, cargo vessels built at astonishing speed. Where Japan took months to complete a single freighter, America launched one Liberty ship every 4 days. Entire shipyards worked in shifts around the clock, welding steel plates under showers of sparks, riveting bulkheads as cranes swung engines into place. In Kaiser's yards on the West Coast, records were set that bordered on the unbelievable. A Liberty ship assembled in less than 5 days. These vessels, plain and unglamorous, became the backbone of the Pacific War. Each one could carry 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to supply a division for weeks. They were slow, barely capable of 17 knots. But their strength lay in numbers. Where Japan sank one, America built 10 more, and surrounding them were faster, more specialized transports, victory ships, troop carriers, oil tankers and repair ships, forming a logistical ecosystem that dwarfed anything Japan could dream of. By 1944, the Pacific had become an American highway. Convoys streamed from San Francisco, Los Angeles and Seattle, passing through Hawaii, staging at Eniwetok, Aleutian, and Guam, before surging toward the Philippines and Okinawa. These were not small clusters of ships, but entire floating cities, guarded by destroyers and aircraft patrols. Radar guided them through storms, escort carriers launched fighters against submarines, anti-aircraft batteries bristled, ready to throw walls of fire into the sky. To the Japanese High Command, reports of these convoys were staggering. Officers accustomed to the small, tight-knit squadrons of the Imperial Navy struggled to comprehend American scale. Where Japan sent tens of ships, America sent hundreds. Where Japan's fuel reserves dwindled, America consumed millions of barrels without hesitation. And where Japan rationed ammunition, America flooded battlefields with shells until the earth itself seemed to collapse. The shock deepened as Japanese intelligence officers pieced together the scope of America's production. They realized too late that every convoy sighted was not the full might of America. It was merely a fraction. While hundreds of ships sailed west, more were already being loaded in California, more were sliding down the slipways in Oregon, more were steaming into Pearl Harbor for their next run. The convoys were not singular events, they were constant, a never-ending pulse of industry across the Pacific. For Japanese soldiers isolated on garrisons from Rabaul to Truk, the arrival of these convoys spelled doom. They watched as American bulldozers reshaped jungles into airfields within days, as fresh divisions arrived with unbroken morale, as tanks rolled ashore with fuel and ammunition already waiting. The Japanese fought bravely, but they fought hungry, undersupplied, abandoned by a navy that could no longer protect them. The contrast was brutal, one side starving, the other fed by an endless artery of steel ships. It was in this context that the sight of convoys stretching to the horizon gained its terrible meaning. For the Japanese observer, it was not just the physical presence of ships, it was the realization that behind every vessel lay a machine of war too vast to stop. The convoy became a symbol of inevitability. It showed that America's war was not fueled by luck or chance, but by design, an industrial design that Japan could never match. By the end of 1944, as the Philippines campaign unfolded, the Japanese Navy was no longer a predator, but a shadow. Its fuel reserves were nearly exhausted, its fleet grounded by shortages, its sailors watching helplessly as convoys delivered the very tools that would storm their islands. The war had entered a new phase, and in this phase, victory would not be decided by a single battle, but by the endless rhythm of supply convoys crossing the Pacific, turning America's industrial heart into a weapon more powerful than any battleship or bomber. For the Japanese sailors staring into the horizon, the question clawed at their minds: how was such a sight even possible? Convoys of this size, stretching beyond vision, seemed like fantasy, a nightmare conjured from fear. Yet it was real. What they did not know, what few in the empire had truly grasped, was that America's strength was not simply in the number of ships or soldiers, but in something less visible, yet far more decisive. Hidden within that ocean of steel lay the true advantage that made it all work: the mastery of logistics, coordination, and communication. In the Pacific, distance was the greatest enemy. Islands were scattered like stepping stones across an ocean that swallowed nations whole. To sustain an army across that vastness required more than just ships. It required a nervous system. Every vessel, from the smallest fuel tanker to the largest troop transport, had to move in rhythm. Supplies had to reach beaches on time. Replacements had to match casualties. Fuel had to be delivered before engines sputtered dry. One broken link could collapse an entire campaign. And yet by 1944, the Americans were orchestrating this with a precision the Japanese could scarcely believe. The hidden advantage was America's ability to transform war into an industrial process. Every convoy was not a haphazard collection of ships. It was a machine, meticulously planned and synchronized. At its heart were innovations invisible to the enemy: standardized containers, pre-packed cargo nets that cranes could swing from dock to deck in minutes, prefabricated structures that could be assembled on beaches. Where Japan spent days unloading supplies by hand, America emptied entire ships in hours. Speed was the secret, and speed came from design. Communication bound this machine together. American ships carried radios that could cut through static, coordinate across fleets, and adjust movements in real time. Orders traveled not by flag signals or runners, but by secure, reliable transmission. A convoy could change course mid-ocean, redirect to another island, or scatter against submarine threats, all without confusion. Japanese vessels, still relying heavily on older radio sets and rigid pre-planned orders, struggled to adapt once their situations changed. To the Imperial Navy, flexibility was weakness. To the Americans, flexibility was survival. The Japanese looked upon the endless columns of ships and saw only steel. What they could not see was the web of planning behind it. The Army Quartermaster Corps, calculating daily calorie needs for 500,000 men. The Navy's Bureau of Ships coordinating schedules across ocean. The War Shipping Administration, assigning Liberty ships to routes with mathematical precision. Behind every convoy was not just a fleet, but an army of planners, logisticians and engineers. It was a hidden army, faceless and silent, yet more powerful than entire divisions. Even the ships themselves carried secrets. Liberty ships, mass-produced in yards across the United States, were built with interchangeable parts. If one engine failed, components from another could replace it. If a section of hull was damaged, standardized steel plates patched. The convoys were designed for resilience, not perfection. Japanese warships, crafted with the elegance of samurai blades, were exquisite, but fragile, difficult to repair once wounded. American transports, ugly and boxy, could take a beating and return to service within days. Their strength lay in their simplicity, in a philosophy of good enough, built fast, built many. This philosophy extended to oil, the lifeblood of mechanized war. Japan, strangled by dwindling reserves, watched helplessly as America moved entire rivers of fuel across the Pacific. Tankers followed the convoys, their holds filled with aviation gasoline, diesel and lubricants. Floating storage depots sprang up on captured islands, feeding fleets that never ran dry. Behind it all lay the petroleum fields of Texas and California, pumping endlessly, refined in plants that worked day and night. The Japanese sailors could not know that while their fleet rationed its last barrels, America's reserves seemed infinite, replenished faster than war could consume them. There was another subtler advantage hidden within those convoys: morale. For the American soldier, stepping onto a transport meant stepping into certainty. He knew that food, ammunition, and reinforcements would follow. He trusted that behind him lay an unbroken chain of supply. For the Japanese soldier, stranded on garrisons with little food and no relief, every battle was a gamble against starvation. Convoys gave Americans not just material power, but psychological power. They fought with confidence, while their enemy fought in despair. When Japanese reconnaissance aircraft caught sight of the endless columns of ships, the reports often carried a tone of disbelief. Numbers were dismissed as exaggeration, even hallucination. How could any nation supply so much, so far from home? Intelligence officers argued, commanders doubted, and yet the convoys kept coming. What they could not grasp was that America had unlocked a new form of warfare, industrialized logistics, where the battlefield was not just measured in trenches or fleets, but in factories, shipping schedules and supply chains. For the Japanese commanders, the realization came too late. By the time they understood that convoys were the arteries of American power, their ability to strike them had vanished. Submarines lacked fuel to hunt, aircraft lacked pilots to launch. Surface fleets, starved of oil, lay idle in port. The great gamble of Pearl Harbor, that America's will would crack before its industry could mobilize, was shattered. Instead, America's hidden advantage had turned the Pacific into its highway, a realm where convoys marched forward like legions of steel. The sight of ships stretching beyond the horizon was only the surface. Beneath that surface lay the true weapon, an unseen structure of logistics, communication, and industrial planning that no Japanese gun could reach. It was this hidden advantage that transformed an island-hopping campaign from impossible to inevitable, that carried the United States across the largest ocean on Earth, and that condemned the Japanese Empire to a war it could no longer hope to win. Engines hummed in low unison, a mechanical heartbeat echoing across the Pacific. The secret power of those convoys was not just their numbers, nor the logistics that choreographed them, but the technology buried within their steel hull. To understand why Japanese sailors looked out in disbelief, one must look deeper, not at the endless horizon of ships, but at the components that made them possible. Every bolt, every radio,
Every welded plate told the story of an industrial machine unlike any the world had ever seen. At the center of this machine stood the Liberty ship. To the untrained eye, it was an ugly vessel, ungainly, box-like, with a blunt bow and awkward lines, yet its very plainness was the secret to its success. Measuring 41 feet in length, with a beam of 57 feet, the Liberty ship displaced over 14,000 tons when fully loaded. Its triple expansion steam engine, an older design considered outdated by naval standards, pushed it along at a steady 11 knots. It was not fast, it was not graceful, but it was reliable, and it could be built in weeks rather than months. The statistics were staggering. Each Liberty ship required about 3,400 tons of steel, 250,000 rivets, and over 30 miles of welding seam. Early models took over 230 days to build, but by 1943, streamlined assembly lines cut that figure to just over 6 weeks. In some cases, records shattered all expectations. The SS Robert Peary was launched in a mere 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes a feat, that stunned the world and humiliated Japanese industry. Inside these grey giants lay the cargo that kept the war alive. One ship could carry enough ammunition to supply a field army for days, or enough food to feed 500,000 men for weeks. Tanks and trucks rolled into their cavernous holds. Aircraft wings were stacked like puzzle pieces. Crates of rifles, machine guns, radios and medical supplies filled every corner. Where the Japanese freighter relied on manual loading with bamboo poles and ropes, Liberty ships employed prefabricated cargo nets and winches, slashing unloading times from days to hours. Alongside the Liberty came the Victory ship, a sleeker, faster design introduced in stretching 455 feet in length, with a more powerful 6,000 horsepower steam turbine. The Victory could reach 15 to 17 knots. This speed allowed it to outrun submarines and keep pace with naval convoys. Where the Liberty was the mule, steady and stubborn, the Victory was the thoroughbred, built for speed and endurance. Between them, they carried the Pacific on their backs. Yet ships alone could not explain the miracle. The true edge lay in communication. On the bridges of American transports, glowing dials and humming tubes came alive in the form of the SCR-68 and SCR-688A radios, crystal-controlled sets that cut through static with unheard clarity. These sets, weighing over 180 pounds, operated on frequency modulation, a technology the Japanese had never mastered. While Japanese sets were plagued by interference, hiss and unreliable range, American radios transmitted voices clear enough to carry instructions across fleet. Convoys became organisms with a nervous system, each ship connected to the others, able to maneuver, regroup, or respond in unison. The Germans had built tanks that outgunned and out-armored their opponents, yet they often fought blind, with radios restricted to command vehicles. The Japanese Navy had mastered daring tactics, yet their ships frequently fought in isolation, with fractured communications. The Americans, by contrast, turned communication into a weapon. A single convoy could redirect course across thousands of miles with precision. Destroyers guarding the flanks could relay submarine sightings instantly. Cargo vessels could stagger their speeds to maintain formation without chaos. This invisible web of information meant convoys moved not as collections of ships, but as synchronized fleets. Then came the fuel. War in the Pacific devoured oil in unimaginable quantities. A single Essex-class carrier consumed 100,000 gallons of fuel oil per day at high speed. A Sherman tank burned 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile of combat travel. The convoys carried this lifeblood in vast quantities. Tankers like the T2 carried 440 to 200 barrels of fuel, enough to keep fleets and armies alive for weeks. Their diesel-electric engines propelled them at 15 knots, fast enough to remain with the larger convoys. The Japanese marveled at their size and cursed their abundance. By 1944, Japan's tankers lay at the bottom of the sea, its reserves dwindling to fumes, while American oilers roamed the Pacific like mobile refineries. Factories made it all possible. The Kaiser yards in Richmond, California, sprawled across the shoreline like cities of fire and steel. Thousands of workers, men, women, immigrants, veterans of the Depression, moved in shifts, under floodlights, welding hulls, lowering engines, hammering plates. Where Japan relied on artisanal shipbuilding, slow and precise, America relied on mass production. Parts were standardized, interchangeable, designed to be swapped as easily as cartridges in a rifle. If one yard fell behind, another picked up the slack. If one ship was lost, 10 more were ready to take its place. The numbers told the truth. with brutal clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, American yards produced 5,777 Liberty ships and 31 Victory ships. Japan produced barely a fraction of that, and most never survived long at sea. Where America's convoys grew in size and confidence, Japan's merchant fleet withered under submarine attack, its lifeline to Southeast Asian oil and rubber cut to shreds. Even the details spoke volumes. American ships bristled with defensive armament, 3-inch deck guns, 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and 40mm Bofors mounts, manned by Navy armed guards, who turned cargo ships into floating fortresses. Radar sets perched atop masts, guiding guns at night or through fog. Japanese freighters, by contrast, sailed with minimal protection, easy prey to submarines and aircraft. It was here, in these details of steel, wire and oil, that the war was truly decided. Japan had entered the conflict with visions of samurai spirit and daring tactics. America entered with rivet guns, welding torches, and assembly lines. One side relied on bravery, the other built an empire of machines, and in the Pacific, machines won. For the Japanese soldier staring at convoys vanishing into the horizon, the sight was overwhelming. But the true horror lay beneath the surface, in the knowledge, if they had known that every ship was part of a system too vast to defeat. Radios whispered across waves, welders in California worked through the night, tankers pumped fuel into the veins of fleets, and Liberty ships carried a nation's arsenal across an ocean. This was America's hidden weapon, not forged in battle, but in factory. And it was this weapon, more than any bomb or bullet, that doomed Japan's empire. September 19, 1944, the fields of Lorraine near the French village of Aricourt lay shrouded in fog. Dew clung to the grass as the dawn mist rolled across the hill. Through the haze, shadows stirred, 39 German Panthers, their engines rumbling like predators waiting for the kill. To their crews, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, this was familiar ground. Their orders were clear: crush the American armor, drive them back, and reclaim the initiative in France. The war, they believed, still had room for German steel to prevail. But what the Germans could not see through the fog was an enemy waiting with a weapon they did not understand. Across the fields, dug into hedgerows and concealed in orchards, American M1 Hellcats crouched like lean hunting dogs, their crews listening to radios crackle with instructions. The battlefield looked silent, but the air was alive with whispered orders flowing across invisible channels. Tank commanders, artillery spotters, and reconnaissance pilots all spoke in a common rhythm, their voices carried through FM radios that cut like knives through static. As the fog thinned, the first Panthers advanced, their 75mm high-velocity guns glinting in the pale sun. German doctrine had not changed: mass, shock and precision. Their armor was superior, their guns deadly, their discipline unquestioned. Yet within minutes, the battlefield unfolded in a way they had never witnessed. Instead of rigid defensive lines, the Americans moved like water. A Hellcat darted from cover, fired, and slipped back into the mist. Artillery shells landed with uncanny accuracy, guided by spotters, who relayed positions instantly through radio. Infantry shifted and reformed, not by shouted commands, but by signals transmitted miles in seconds.
The Germans were stunned. Their own radios, crackling with static, struggled to cut through the chaos. Orders from commanders reached crews too late. Squadrons that should have moved as one fell into disarray. In contrast, the Americans appeared to anticipate each movement. One Panther platoon cresting a ridge found itself bracketed by artillery within minutes. Another rolled into a valley, only to be ambushed by tanks already repositioned. To the German officers, it was as though the Americans were reading their thoughts, reacting faster than humanly possible. The truth was far simpler, yet far more devastating. The Americans were connected, and the Germans were not. Each Sherman or Hellcat, despite being individually weaker, fought as part of a larger organism. Radios turned scattered units into coordinated blades, cutting apart the German assault piece by piece. By midday, smoke columns rose into the sky. Panther after Panther burned, their black plumes staining the horizon. German crews, who had once sneered at the thin armor of American tanks, now sat bewildered in the wreckage of their superiority. Their weapons were still lethal, their courage intact, but their command structure had collapsed in the face of something they could not counter: speed of information. The Battle of Aricourt became a brutal lesson. German reports afterwards spoke of American units appearing and vanishing with impossible speed, of artillery that seemed guided by unseen eyes, of tanks that should have been outflanked but were already waiting. One officer wrote bitterly, "They strike as though they are one body, many arms with one mind." It was not magic, it was the radio. The losses told the story with ruthless clarity. Over the course of 2 weeks, the German 5th Panzer Army lost nearly 200 tanks and armored vehicles, most of them Panthers, to American forces that were outgunned on paper. The Americans lost less than a quarter of that number. Kill ratios, once expected to lean heavily in Germany's favor, were turned upside down. The Panther, feared across Europe, was rendered vulnerable, not by thicker armor or bigger guns, but by the coordination of its enemy. Arakourt was not the only place this drama unfolded. Across the Pacific, similar stories emerged. At sea, Japanese submarines attempted to stalk American convoys, only to be hunted down by destroyer escorts, acting in seamless cooperation. Radar picked up contacts, radios transmitted warnings, depth charges rained down in precise patterns. What once might have been easy kills turned into slaughter. On land, from the jungles of New Guinea to the plains of the Philippines, Japanese commanders faced American units that could call artillery within minutes, redirect air support mid-battle, and shift reserves instantly. A Japanese officer noted with despair that their artillery falls as if guided by the gods, unable to grasp that the gods in question were radios and trained operators. To the Japanese soldier, the arrival of American convoys was overwhelming enough. The endless ships, the endless supplies. But the real terror came when those supplies reached the battlefield. Fresh tanks, fresh men, fresh guns, always moving, always coordinated. Even when Japanese defenders fought ferociously, they were undone by the speed with which Americans adapt. A breakthrough that might have collapsed a line against another enemy was patched within hours, reinforcements arriving as though conjured from thin air. The convoys and the radios were two halves of the same weapon. The convoys brought material, the radios turned that material into coordinated power. Without communication, the mountains of supplies would have been scattered, wasted, vulnerable. With communication, they became unstoppable momentum. The Germans at Arakourt, the Japanese at Leyte, the Italians in Sicily, all faced the same nightmare. They were not merely outnumbered, they were outpaced, out-coordinated, outthought in real time. Where their doctrines emphasized rigid planning, the Americans embraced fluidity. Radios allowed them to abandon strict formations, to improvise, to respond faster than their enemies could react. By the end of the battle at Arakourt, the fog of dawn had lifted, revealing fields littered with burned-out Panthers, their hulks smoldering under the French sun. American tankers leaned against their Hellcats and Shermans, weary but alive, knowing they had faced the best of Germany and prevailed. They did not know that Japanese sailors, thousands of miles away, were staring at convoys beyond the horizon with the same sense of disbelief. But the connection was there, invisible, yet undeniable. It was not merely America's numbers that were winning the war. It was the hidden edge of communication and coordination, amplified by convoys that delivered endless reinforcements. The convoy was the artery, the radio was the pulse. Together, they turned the tide of World War II. By 1944, the world's battlefields had become laboratories of change. Generals still pored over maps, drew arrows, and issued long chains of orders. But in practice, the rhythm of war had shifted. The great battles of World War II were no longer decided solely by tanks, planes, or battleships, but by invisible threads of communication that tied armies together. Consider the skies over Europe. For years, Allied bombers had braved German flak and fighters in daylight raids, suffering terrible losses. Precision was nearly impossible when each squadron acted on limited information. Yet, when radios became standard in every bomber and escort fighter, the equation changed. Suddenly, bomber groups could redirect mid-air, adapt to shifting winds, or concentrate on targets identified moments earlier. Fighter escorts, once scattered, now moved like a shield, covering bombers from sudden Luftwaffe attacks. What had once been chaotic skies became orchestrated symphonies of destruction. On the ground, radios made the difference between disaster and survival. During the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, German forces launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes. For days, chaos reigned as weather grounded Allied aircraft, and confusion gripped the front. But small American units, often surrounded and cut off, held their positions longer than expected, because even a single working radio could connect an isolated outpost to artillery batteries miles away, summoning firepower on advancing columns. A few platoons with radios could punch far above their weight, delaying the offensive until the skies cleared and reinforcements surged forward. And behind these radios came the convoys, the arteries of the Allied war effort. On the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled with deadly efficiency, seeking to starve Britain into submission. Early in the war, convoys had been ragged, poorly coordinated, and easy prey. But by 1943, the system had matured. Destroyers, corvettes, and long-range patrol aircraft, coordinated via radio, weaving a protective net around merchant ships. Radar picked up submarines before they could strike, and messages flashed across the Atlantic in seconds, rerouting ships and closing gaps in defense. What had once been a slaughterhouse for Allied shipping became a graveyard for U-boats. In the Pacific, the convoy principle reached its zenith. American industrial might poured endless supplies westward, carried in vast armadas of transports, escorted by destroyers and carriers. Each convoy was not a lumbering column of ships, but a living network, guided by radio, defended by radar, reinforced at will. Japanese submarines, once hopeful of cutting these lifelines, found themselves hunted instead. Convoys delivered not only weapons, but also fresh divisions, food and fuel, every ingredient of modern war, arriving in rhythm, unstoppable. These turning points, Aracourt, the Atlantic convoys, the Bulge, the Pacific landings, proved a single truth. Radios and convoys shattered the old rules. No longer could a commander rely on rigid plans drawn days in advance. No longer could an isolated victory turn the tide without cutting the enemy's lifelines. Instead, war had become a contest of coordination, of keeping the pulse steady while delivering force to the right place at the right time. To the Axis powers, this shift was devastating. German tanks could outshoot Shermans, Japanese soldiers could outfight in close combat, but without the ability to match Allied coordination, their victories bled away into nothing. Every Panther knocked out at Aracourt could not be replaced quickly enough. Every Japanese bunker destroyed in the Pacific was soon bypassed by fresh reinforcements, brought in on convoys. Radios gave speed, convoys gave endurance. Together, they ensured that even setbacks became temporary, while successes compounded. By late 1944, the writing was on the wall. The Allies had not just more men and material, they had rewired the very structure of warfare. The battlefield was no longer a place of isolated units, but a single sprawling organism, its lifeblood flowing across oceans, and its nerves sparking through radio waves. The turning points of the war were not just about who fired the deadliest shot, but who heard and responded the fastest. And in that contest, the Allies had gained an edge that no amount of steel or courage could overcome. The war was over, but its lessons refused to fade. In the ruins of Berlin, in the ashes of Tokyo, the victors studied not just the weapons that had carried them to triumph, but the invisible threads that bound their armies together. Radios and convoys had done more than win battles, they had redefined what it meant to wage modern war. In the immediate aftermath, those lessons were codified into doctrine. NATO, newly formed in 1949, placed communication at its very core. No longer would Allied armies rely on slow couriers or vulnerable wires. Instead, radio networks stretched across Europe, linking divisions from Canada, Britain, France, and the United States into one coherent force. The Soviets, watching from the east, drew their own conclusion. They invested in mass production of armored vehicles and artillery, but they also poured resources into electronic warfare, jamming, intercepting, and disrupting the channels that had given the Allies such an edge. The Cold War, from its earliest years, was shaped less by tanks and bombs than by the race to control the spectrum of communication. In Korea, the echoes of World War II were unmistakable. United Nations forces, stretched thin against waves of North Korean and Chinese troops, survived because of convoys that poured supplies from Japanese ports into Busan, Incheon and beyond. Radios linked scattered units in frozen valleys and rugged hills, allowing airstrikes and artillery to fall with deadly precision. Again, logistics and communication proved the hidden backbone of resistance. By Vietnam, the pattern had grown sharper still. American helicopters roared across jungles, carrying radios that tied them to command centers miles away. Convoys rumbled through contested highways,
guarded by aircraft and gun trucks, sustaining a war fought half a world away from home. Critics would argue the strategy, but one truth remained: without radios and convoys, the war would have ended far sooner, and not in America's favor. Then came the Gulf War of 1991, a conflict often called the first network-centric war. Coalition forces led by the United States didn't simply maneuver divisions and brigades, they maneuvered information, satellites, encrypted radios, and computer networks, allowed real-time coordination across thousands of miles. Convoys delivered not just ammunition and fuel, but also the infrastructure of communication, mobile command posts, radar systems, satellite uplinks. Iraq's army, despite being one of the largest in the world, was paralyzed. Its units, isolated and blind, collapsed under an enemy that moved as a single coordinated whole. This was the true legacy of World War II's hidden advantage. The lessons of radios crackling across North Africa, of convoys stretching beyond the horizon in the Pacific, had grown into a doctrine that reshaped warfare itself. Victory no longer belonged to the strongest arm or the heaviest tank. It belonged to the side that could think, move, and strike as one. And even in the 21st century, the echoes continue. Modern armies live inside webs of satellites, drones, secure networks, and supply chains that span the globe. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, victory still depends on convoys that never falter, and radios that never go silent. The weapons may have changed: stealth fighters, precision missiles, cyber tools, but the foundation remains the same. Without communication, without logistics, even the most advanced force becomes a collection of helpless fragments. For the Japanese soldiers, staring at endless American convoys in 1944, it was a revelation too late to matter. For German tank crews facing foes that vanished and reappeared with uncanny coordination, it was a mystery they could not solve. And for the world that followed, it was a turning point etched into the very nature of war. Steel and courage alone could no longer win. In the crucible of World War II, the Allies had discovered a deeper law of conflict. Connection outweighed firepower, endurance defeated brilliance, and speed overcame strength. The battlefield had spoken, and its lesson was clear. In modern war, it is not the mightiest weapon that decides the future, but the unseen lifelines that hold an army together.